The heads sat on the mantel like prized artworks. Only these weren't sculptures or busts. They were real, severed, preserved. Some still had traces of dried blood around their lips. Lips he had kissed. The most beautiful ones he kept for weeks. He would visit them, alone in his private chambers, speaking to their decomposing faces, admiring the way death changed them. It sounds like the setup for a modern horror film. Twisted tale of necrophilia, serial murder, and psychological decay. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. This was France. In the 1430s. Inside the towering stone walls of a noble estate, one of the richest men in Europe, praised by kings, honored on battlefields, was collecting the heads of children with the same passion others reserve for collecting art. Think about that. Think about that. Before the term serial killer existed, before modern criminology or psychological profiling, before any understanding of sadistic pathology, the same terrifying patterns we associate with 20th century monsters were already present. The keeping of trophies, the sexual gratification from killing, the selective targeting of beautiful victims, the ritualistic revisiting of corpses, even the fascination with anatomy, cutting into flesh to see what lay beneath. But the most disturbing part, this killer wasn't a recluse, wasn't hiding in alleyways or lurking in shadows. He was a national hero, a celebrated warlord and marshal of France. He had fought beside Joan of Arc. He commanded armies. He built churches for nearly a decade while poor children vanished around his castles. No one could lay a finger on him. Power protected him. Fame blinded those who might have questioned. And when Gilles de Rais finally stood on the scaffold in 1440, surrounded by sobbing parents and political enemies, he wasn't just another criminal. He was the center of a mystery that still haunts historians today. To understand how a man could descend so far into darkness, how the same hands that once raised the sword to free France would later raise blades against innocent children, we have to go back to where this nightmare began.
Northwestern France, 1404.
A boy is born into obscene wealth. His family controls so much land, so many castles, that they rival entire kingdoms. The countryside bears his family crest, his
Name, Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, later
shortened to Gilles D after the barony he would inherit. You might assume a boy born into such privilege would have a charmed life, but his world was built on blood, and it began spilling early. Just 11, Gilles likely witnessed the gruesome death of his father, who was mauled by a wild boar in a hunting
accident.
Soon after, his mother died, leaving the boy an orphan before he'd even learned to wield the sword. His fate then fell to his maternal grandfather, Jean the Crayon, a man who would shape him into something both brilliant and monstrous. Jean didn't raise Gilles to be wise or compassionate. He raised him to be useful, power-hungry, and calculating. Jean saw his grandson as a pawn for political gain. Later on trial for unspeakable crimes, Gilles would blame it all on this man, on the way he was raised without discipline, allowed to indulge every cruel whim, every corrupt instinct. And it's not just an excuse. Jean taught Gilles more than swordsmanship or military tactics. He taught him that nobility meant entitlement, that wealth justified cruelty, that the weak existed only to serve the strong. By 16, Gilles was already displaying a chilling duality. On the surface, he was gifted, fluent in Latin, well-read, charming, but underneath he was volatile, prone to bursts of rage and acts of violence, qualities that would one day terrify. Parents were the same ones that made him a terrifying force in battle. His rise was meteoric. By 23, Gilles was serving under the DFA, the future Charles IIth. At that time, France was in shambles, battered by the H-100 Red Years' War, the English occupying vast regions, and morale at rock bottom. Then something extraordinary happened. A teenage girl appeared claiming divine vision. She said God had sent her to save France. Her name Jeanne d'Arc. Most nobles laughed. Gilles didn't. He was assigned to protect her in battle to ensure she survived the coming chaos. Together, they became something like legend. The siege of Olan had dragged on for 6 brutal months. The English forces were immovable. Then Joan and Gilles arrived. Within 4 days, the siege was shattered. A peasant girl and a young nobleman did what experienced generals couldn't do in half a year. Town after town fell under their combined leadership. Gilles, always at the front, earned a reputation for unmatched courage. At just 25, he was named Marshal of France, the highest military honor. But here's what most don't realize. Even as he was winning glory on the battlefield, something inside him was shifting. Medieval warfare was grotesque. Cities were pillaged, prisoners tortured, innocents slaughtered. Some historians believe that this constant exposure to death and brutality awakened something already latent in Gilles, a darkness seated in childhood, now finally free. When Joan of Arc was captured in 1430, Gilles made no attempt to rescue her. When she was burned at the stake the next year, he didn't even attend her execution. Instead, he disappeared from public life, retired to his estates, a war hero at the peak of his fame gone, and what emerged in his place was something unrecognizable. Gilles began spending money with reckless abandon. He commissioned a grand theatrical production about the siege of Boulogne, casting hundreds of actors and feeding every audience member for free. His household swelled to over 200 guards, and servants all dressed in luxury. He commissioned art, music, manuscripts, but it was the chapel that raised eyebrows. In 1433, he built the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. Its choir boys, selected by Gilles himself for their voices and their beauty. The name of the chapel was no accident. The Holy Innocents, a biblical reference to the children murdered by King Herod, a name that would take on a grotesque irony. Just a few years later, as Gilles' wealth dwindled, his grip on reality seemed to slip. He began selling off land piece by piece, even as his family pleaded with the king to intervene. He refused to stop, refused to explain, and all the while in the villages near his many castles, children were beginning to disappear. By the time his fortune began to vanish, something else, something far more terrifying, had already begun. Behind the castle gates, started with whispers. A few missing children here and there, mostly peasants. They'd gone to the castles of Gilles begging for bread, offering to work, never to return. At first, the disappearances were dismissed as nothing unusual. After all, noble households often took in young boys as pages, and it wasn't uncommon for poor children to vanish into servitude. But soon the pattern grew too disturbing to ignore. These weren't isolated vanishings anymore. They were spreading across the countryside. Everywhere Gilles had a stronghold, a farrier's apprentice lent to Gilles' cousin for an errand vanished. Merchant's son delivering fabrics never made it home. The stories all followed a similar script. A child approached the gates of Machecoul or Talges, was invited in, promised food or work or even education. Some were personally recruited by Gilles' servants, told they'd be joining the great lord's choir or household, and then nothing. They were never seen again. First, the villagers whispered among themselves. Noblemen weren't to be questioned, and Who, after all, would dare accuse the Marshal of France? But behind closed doors, fear began to take root. The most sinister details came later. Testimonies that describe bodies being removed under cover of night, others burned in fire, pits deep within the castles. By 1437, things had reached a breaking point. Eyewitnesses claimed dozens of child corpses were hauled from one of Gilles' estates, but no one dared take action. Gilles' power was too vast, his name too revered. Even as the deaths piled up, he remained untouchable. As his financial ruin deepened, Gilles turned from earthly pleasures to the occult, seeking salvation not from God, but from demons. He brought in alchemists and mystics, desperate to restore his lost wealth through supernatural means. Among them was a young Italian cleric named
Francesco Pratti.
a man who claimed he could summon demonic spirits and who quickly became Gilles' confidant. The goal was simple: summon a demon named Baron who in exchange for sacrifices would reveal the location of hidden treasure. And the sacrifices required the hand, the heart, the eyes, and the blood of a child. Suddenly, the murders took on a new dimension, not just acts of cruelty, but of ritual sacrifices performed with chilling intent. When Gilles finally confessed years later, the court was stunned not only by what he admitted, but by the calm, almost surgical way he described it. The children would first be lured, usually by promises of food or work. Once inside the castle, they were treated with kindness, sometimes bathed, clothed, even fed lavish meals. And then the game would begin. He would comfort them, dry their tears, assure them they were safe, and then he would string them up hooks in the ceiling. Children hung by the neck until they passed out, revived, hung again. Sometimes this process continued for hours. The child would beg. Gilles would smile. Then came the killing. There were many methods: slitting throats, breaking necks with wooden rods, slowly soaring with a sword called a brack. At times Gilles watched. Other times he participated directly, but the horror didn't end with death. Gilles would dismember them, opening up their bellies to marvel at their organs. He would kiss their dead mouths, caress their skin, and when a child's face struck him as especially beautiful, he would sever the head and keep it, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Displayed on his mantelpiece, the heads were treated like relics, visited, admired, even spoken to. When the stench became unbearable, he would order the remains burned or buried in secret. And then he'd begin the hunt again. The numbers defy belief. During his trial, when asked how many children he had killed, Gilles answered simply, he'd lost count. Officially, the court charged him with the deaths of 100. Some historians believe the number was closer to 200. Others argue it could have been 800 or more. No one truly knows. Many bodies were reduced to ash. Others vanished into rivers or hidden pits, never uncovered. But even with all this terror, he remained free for 8 years. 8 years of disappearance, murder, and desecration, and no one in power moved against him. The question that haunts historians is simple. How did he escape justice for so long? The answer lies in the nature of medieval power. Gilles wasn't some outlaw hiding in forests. He was nobility, entitled, protected, revered. Peasants had no voice, no court that would listen. Even if dozens of parents had dared accuse him, they would have been crushed by his wealth, his soldiers, his titles. Took a mistake, a single miscalculation, for that wall of protection to crack. In May of 1440, Gilles got into a property dispute with a local priest named Jean Lefrin. Instead of settling it through legal means, Gilles chose violence. He stormed the church with armed men and abducted Lefren Midsman, dragging him away at sword point in full view of the congregation. That act shattered any remaining protection. Even nobility couldn't excuse the violent seizure of a priest from holy ground. Gilles had gone too far. The Bishop of Nantes, who had long harbored suspicions, finally had the pretext he needed. But even then, they didn't arrest Gilles for murder. That was still too dangerous. The official charges were heresy and church assault, safe accusations that carried legal weight without directly confronting his more terrifying crimes. In September 1440, an armed force from the Duke of Brittany surrounded the castle of Massacre. Gilles, despite having hundreds of trained soldiers, didn't resist. He simply walked out and surrendered, as if he knew the game was over, as if some part of him had been waiting for the moment justice or damnation would finally arrive. When the Duke of Brittany soldiers marched on Gilles de Rais castle in the early fall of 1414, they weren't met with cannon fire or a defiant nobleman ready to defend his fortress. Instead, Gilles surrendered without a word. No sword raised, no siege, no final stand. This man, once Marshal of France, a warrior who had charged into battle beside Joan, simply gave up, as if exhausted, as if waiting for it all to end. But even as he was taken into custody, the charges had little to do with the mounting horror whispered among the peasantry. Officially, Gilles was arrested for assaulting a priest and for heresy.
Crime.
The church and crown could acknowledge without admitting what many already feared, that a decorated war hero might be the most prolific child killer in European history. What followed was one of the most chilling and contradictory trials in all of medieval history. Two parallel courts, the secular and the ecclesiastical, each moved swiftly, their aims clear. The secular court wanted justice for the assault on the church and for the murders that could no longer be ignored. The ecclesiastical court, however, had a more spiritual goal: to purge heresy, to stamp out the occult rituals and demon worship allegedly performed inside Gilles' crumbling castles. From the beginning, Gilles was combative. He refused to recognize the authority of the court, mocking the judges, sneering at the accusations. When they read out the charges, 49 articles in total, ranging from ritual murder to sodomy to demon summoning, he denied everything. In response, the church excommunicated him, stripping him of the right to receive the sacraments or be buried in consecrated ground. For a nobleman of the 15th century, this was a fate worse than death. It meant eternal damnation, and that finally broke him. On October 15th, Gilles appeared before the court, a changed man. He apologized to the judges, acknowledged the court's authority, and agreed to confess. But his first confessions were limited, calculated. He admitted to sins, but denied involvement with demons. He spoke of moral failings, not atrocities. The turning point came just days later. On October 20th, the prosecutors reminded him calmly, coldly, that the court had the right to use torture. They wouldn't need to follow through. The threat alone unraveled him. Gu agreed to confess, fully, without restraint. What he said next would send ripples through history. Over the course of several days, in graphic, articulate detail, he described the murders of dozens, possibly hundreds, of children. He wept as he spoke, not from madness or delusion, but with the precise, clear recollection of a man who knew exactly what he had done. He spoke of the process of luring the children, of comforting them, of watching the fear in their eyes give way to trust, only to turn that trust into terror. He told them how he hung children from beams, revived them, then killed them slowly, how he dismembered their bodies not in rage but in awe, how he He kissed their lips after death, admired their insides and kept their heads as if they were fine works of art. He named his accomplices, Henriette, known as Henriette and Pooh, both loyal servants who aided him in the killings. They too were brought before the court, and they too confessed. Their testimonies mirrored Gilles in nearly every detail. They described disposing of bodies, cleaning up blood, finding new victims, even assisting in the twisted rituals meant to summon demons. They confirmed the presence of Francesco Prelati, the Italian cleric, and the sacrificial demands of the demon baron. The court was horrified but also satisfied. With such confessions, there could be no question of guilt. Gu had not only broken the law, he had shattered every moral boundary imaginable, and yet even at the end his noble birth granted him certain privileges. He requested to make a final confession and be restored to the church, so that he could face death not as a damned heretic but as a penitent soul. The request was granted. He would be allowed Christian burial. His servants would not. Their corpses would burn too. October 26, 1440. The morning was gray, heavy with mist as thousands gathered in the meadow outside Nantes to witness the execution. Nobles stood beside peasants, merchants, soldiers, mothers whose children had vanished. There was no chaos, no shouting, only silence. Gilles arrived, dressed in white, the color of repentance. He stood tall, proud even, and addressed the crowd. He spoke of forgiveness. He begged parents to raise their children strictly, blaming his own descent into depravity on the leniency of his upbringing. He asked that his servants be executed after him so they would not fear their fate. The crowd watched in grim stillness as the noose was placed around his neck. He turned to his accomplices one last time, telling them to die bravely and to think only of salvation. And then, without ceremony, the platform dropped. Gilles de Rais died, not with screams, but with silence. His body was quickly cut down and placed on P. As promised, the flames were stopped before they could consume him fully. His remains were taken to the church of Notre-Dame where he was buried. His servants were not so fortunate. Their corpses were left in the fire until nothing remained but ash. The crowd slowly dispersed, some weeping, others too numb to speak, and somewhere among them stood the parents of the lost, carrying grief too deep for language. Could have ended there. Monster caught, a sentence served. But the story of Gilles wasn't finished. Not even close. Because in the centuries to come, historians, judges, and skeptics would return to this case again and again, not to marvel at his evil, but to ask a far more uncomfortable question. What if the confessions were lies, extracted under threat of torture? What if the accusations were crafted not to punish evil but to seize power? And suddenly the trial of a monster began to look like the possible murder of a scapegoat. The flames may have claimed his body, but the truth was far from settled. In the centuries that followed the execution of Gilles de, the questions refused to die. The ashes had long since scattered, the castles crumbled, and the chapel built with blood money stood in ruin, but the horror lingered like smoke. Gilles truly a monster, or was he the victim of a ruthless political plot? On one side are the skeptics armed with reason and a keen understanding of
Médiévale corruption.
They point to the lack of physical evidence.
No bodies.
Were found in the castles during the investigation.
No bones, no preserve.
Heads, no tangible proof of mass murder. Only testimonies years after the supposed crimes and confessions, extracted under threat of excommunication, torture, and death. Even by the standards of the time, this was suspect. Torture could make any man say anything. Confession didn't always equal guilt. Often equal desperation, and Gilles had plenty of enemies. His accusers were not disinterested observers. The Duke of Brittany, who orchestrated the prosecution, conveniently inherited all of Gilles' lands after the execution. The Bishop of Nantes, who led the ecclesiastical charge, gained substantial political clout in the aftermath. The court that condemned him stood to benefit immensely from his fall. In 1992, over 500 years later, a group of French scholars and legal experts held a symbolic retrial using modern standards of justice. The verdict, not guilty. They ruled that the evidence was insufficient, the motives of his accusers suspicious, the legal